So beidir go poeme ar an míle mar bhis to live, just on behalf of the school seminar committee. Dr. Emina Corhick, Dr. Ciarán Galván and myself, bhailim na mórtha fáilte a choróibh go léir ó Chiana so Chongur and more locally as well. I suppose it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the week that's in it, which is to say week 12, the final week of lectures here at UCC. So Bulabus the Nahene, Assation of Wintermach. And I suppose it's a particular pleasure to introduce again on behalf of the School Seminar Committee our colleague an Dr. Tomás Liam Ó Murchú, who is a lecturer in the Department of Modern Irish here at UCC, a native Irish speaker with close family ties to an Ghráig and the Gaeltacht of Cork. His scholarly interests include the development and cultivation of accentual Irish poetry from around 1600, the folk songs of Munster, post-classical Gaelic or Irish lexicon, the language, oral traditions and literature of Cork. He has lectured Irish language and literature at NUI Galway, the University of Ottawa and Maynooth. He is chairperson of Cuiste Cheiliúrtha an Blascéad and is also the editor of Cheiliúrtha an Blascéad's annual journal, Irish Cheiliúrtha an Blascéad. Mar sin, gur míle maith agat a hamáil.
Maithe gota alba agus gur maithe gaibh. I gan steicenis tá chuin an Scoilán nó beidir go bhfuil seach go maithe go mai dhéanamh inis. Mar sin alba betas mar seoirí go agus sa ráile mátá sé le fiscint. Sé sin le fiscint inis.
Tá sé hamáis, tá go dain.
Agus díanamh iad mór mar sin be míad a brathir na Sleanáin. I would like to thank the school and the members of the committee, Alba, Ciarán and Emma, for inviting me to speak at the Spring Seminar Series for 2021. I would like to also congratulate my fellow speakers, Cian and Maria and Nick, on their talks. And finally, I would like to thank Dr. Liam Ó Murchú for discussing aspects of this paper with me. My first proper encounter with the formal lament and accentual verse was in a postgraduate seminar at the Keogh Norton Centre for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame, taught by Professor Brondan Ó Buachalla. I had received a Fulbright FLTA scholarship to Notre Dame for the 2007-2008 academic year. Brondan offered to put on an extra seminar for myself, Father Ó Murchú, who is here today, or present, who was on the Government of Ireland scholarship, and to two Irish-speaking PhD students, Muireann Vegley and Ciarán Chanila. We were offered the choice between Cuairte Bheonaí or Eagán Ó Rathile. We opted for Ó Rathile as Brondan was the leading authority, with his edition of 22 of Ó Rathile's poems having been just published by Field Day that same year. That publication was the first of 4 selections of 17th and 18th century Munster poets in this short-lived series started by Brondan Ó Buachalla, who was also series editor. Ón Rua Sullivan, edited by Brondan Ó Cunachúil, came next, followed by Sean Clark MacDonald, edited by Eamon O'Hogan, and finally Ewi McCritine, edited by Vincent Morley, arrived in 2012. Unfortunately, Brondan did not get to see the last 2 in print due to his untimely death in May 2010. At least one more edition was on the cards, a relatively unknown poet called Iliam Ó Leann, with Dr. Neil Buttimer as editor. Much work is to be carried out in the field of post-classical Irish literature, and with almost a decade gone since Vincent Morley's edition of AV, perhaps it is time to consider resurrecting the Field Day series and continuing with the work that Brondan started. Let us get back to Notre Dame and to the fall term of 2007. In the week leading up to the first class, he gifted each of us a signed copy of his Eagán Ó Rathile edition, wishing us luck for the forthcoming term. This gesture reflected his generosity and approach he took as a senior professor, who wanted to share as much of his knowledge and experience with his students as possible in a relaxed manner that made him very approachable and inspired confidence in his students. Some of you who've sat or indeed taught courses on Eagán Ó Rathile will be familiar with his beautiful poems in Uachtaráin metre and would expect a classic like Town Tome or Aisling Eagán Ó Rathile to be good introductory poems for a seminar. That was not the case in Brondan's class, as we began by reading Cnágus Dochar the Ghortig Machéadfa, a 264-line poem in Cuine metre about, as my penciled note after the final verse says, Cuine ed own ed hemus agus ed Aiden a lament for Owen MacCartha, for James II, and for Ireland. He explained the rules of the metre, and we applied those rules, and we read out verses that Brown coloured in the rest by way of explaining the context, style, and so forth. Even on the first read, the language was accessible for me and my fellow scholars, a point worth bearing in mind as we discuss this kind of poetry today. When we arrived at the 14th verse movement that would set out Owen's pedigree opening of Ráthid, Farragus, Columma, Cleachtach, kinsman to Fergus, who was brave and wounding, I have a clear memory of Brown telling us with some delight that people find long genealogical litanies like it, which are typical in this kind of poetry, tedious, but that there was a skill and an art in him that he enjoyed. And why wouldn't he? His passions all in one place, the Irish language literature, and history. I should state at this point that much of what will be said today is observational, not an exhaustive study by any means. I'm currently preparing an edition on the 12 extant elegies composed on the death of James Cotter in 1720. One of them is a formal lament, Mór an Scoil le Raim de Chéasma, by Liam Ó Murchú. It is from observations made from that and poems similar to it that this paper has been drawn up. Unmadana, an elegy or lament, a poem composed to recall the virtues of the dead, has been practiced by our poets from time immemorial. It is based on the lament or the keen of the people, a practice that continued in Ireland up until the 19th century, if not later. One of the oldest formal laments we have dates from AD 661, when Column, patron saint of Cloyne, composed an elegy for Cummeen Fóta. From around the 12th century, the lay poets of the schools eulogized their deceased patrons in strict syllabic verse. This continued for over 400 years, eventually giving way to looser syllabic metre, and ultimately, due in part to the upheavals of the 17th century and the demise of the schools, a new order came about, or Racht Nua, as it is referred to in the Neen's dictionary, that is poetry composed by professional poets in accentual metre. The formal lament held its position as a centrepiece in the repertoire of a poet, with its theme staying much the same as its syllabic antecedent. The poet's personal anguish about the death of his patron, the sorrow of the subject's family and community, the subject's character, virtues, generosities, feats, and so forth. In the case of a chieftain, his stock and pedigree, as well as his ancestral lands, are often treated. The 17th century was a century of wars and death, with many men of importance falling in battle, thus increasing the demand for formal laments, as well as for poets with the skill, talent, and knowledge that could produce fitting eulogies. It is likely that the esteem in which the dead person was held in while alive should be reflected in the quality of the elegy or elegies composed for him. The focus of this paper is formal laments in accentual metre called Cuine, and we will pay special attention to longer poems that exceed 180 lines or 45 stanzas. But first let us digress and briefly trace the origins of this metre and form. From the late 16th and early 17th centuries, it is clear that we have two parallel streams of accentual verse. One stream is exemplified by the accentual poem of Taig Dál O'Higgin, beginning Shark Mona Irvita I Leg Vail, composed around 1591. A later example is Shaharun's Caton, well-known poem of political analysis, beginning Scoil le Orva Fáil ní Cholam Ihe. The metre of poems of this type is often called Durán. It is a highly ornate metre, and its practitioners were clearly well educated and trained in composition. Of course, they also had expertise in syllabic poetry. An early example in our period of this type of metre, put to use for the purposes of elegy, is a literary lament by Connachúr mac Trélig Óig I Connachúr for Uine Mór, Uine Ó Móra, who perished in battle in 1600. The first line of which is a Húlín Chrí le Dít de Huin Gafol. But from around the beginning of the 17th century, we encounter laments in accentual metre of a less polished nature. It is possible that these were used originally by keening women, but by others who also desired to produce almost extempore laments for loved ones. An example from 1617 is Fanúil an Ivrian's lament for her husband, Winnemora Lochlin, chief of the Burn and Thomond. Its initial line is Inanimon Spid Leave, Timri, Uine. Kathleen Dove, the Thomond woman poet, also used this accentual metre in her laments in the early decades of the 17th century. This metre is also the one used by composers of political poetry in the mid-17th century. Metrically, these laments are marked by a constant recurring vowel in the last foot of each line and by a pattern of 2 internal assonances. They do not seem to have been composed in 4-line units or verses at first. These laments were adopted by poets who had training in syllabic metres, such as Hakead, Caton, or Brother. They were much elaborated by them, including the imposition of the strictness of quatrain arrangements from the syllabic tradition. There was also a shorter line rusk, there was also the shorter line rusk of the Quina Articulata type, used as a quasi-extempore lament. This type has a long history. It is possible that it was practiced in certain geographic areas in Munster at any rate, while the longer line lament was common in other areas. And we move on to our first slide. Here we see Fionnuala ní Bhríon's lament for her husband, Uain Mór O'Loughlin, from 1617. The X marks the internal assonance with the long vowel O, bump, bump, Morvach no Oige gan, making the assonance in the first line, with the long vowel E, bump, bump, making the assonance in the second line, Vrito the Scoil for, long vowel O in the third, Stor, Cov, and short vowel A, bump, bump, bump. Aglish is S, Allavan in the fourth. The final foot is uniform throughout its 48 lines with the diphthong ua bump, making the rhyme gruamrut, guadus, guashart, gruamrut. Slide 2. Here we have a more polished example from Caton, from Sharon Caton, from around 1618, only a year after Fionnuala's poem. The X marks the assonance with the diphthong ua bump, thrua mo, guash on, making the assonance in the opening line, the long vowel a bump, making the assonance in the second, vashna, vlana, with the long vowel a bump, making the assonance in the third and fourth lines. The final foot, uniform throughout, its 116 lines, is o bump, glow. Have I misread that? Glow, red, oige, lona, Porsche. The third slide. Here we have another example of the Queen metre from around 1750 by an unknown poet, composed not too far from where Caton was 130 years earlier. Little has changed in terms of metre and form. The final foot is E bump, Vime, Quinte, Sihe, Quisker. We have 3 internal assonances in the opening 5 lines. Long vowels A bump, A bump, A bump. This can be described as a 5-line unit, the same assonance being the uniting factor. Elaboration of this kind is often found at the beginning of a poem, acting as an extra decoration and a display of the poet's skills. In slide 4, we have an example of Queen and the Line, or Queen and the Line Tigara, the most famous of all being Quina Articulata, composed by Eileen Dubney Hunnell in 1773. It is in a metre called Rusk, which is very similar to the Quina metre we just looked at. The lines are concise and end, like the Quina, with the reoccurring vowel in the last foot. This usually changes from movement to movement. This example is from the mother of Diarmid Mac Owen, Quina Macora, from around 1850 near Mill Street in County Cork. And bana na muchina is na ngad sinkana the vechshiv strimmelte the nauchshiv mushere is knuk b'yireva fe mariyinasa. In slide 5, here we have an example of a political poem composed by an amateur poet around 1655. Internal assonance is observed only occasionally. There were no 4-line verses, but it does maintain the same final foot throughout. You can see the occasional use of assonance marked in green there. The Queen metre, although associated with elegies, was often selected by poets who wanted to communicate long narratives to the public, be it of a political or a societal nature, with the intention that it would be circulated by word of mouth as opposed to manuscript. Slide 6, here's an elaborate and ornate example of the Queen metre by Padraig and Hakead, dating from around the same period as the political poem from the previous slide. 1640 to be precise. There is alliteration in all 352 lines, with the majority made with the last word of the internal assonance and the stress word in the final foot, E bump. Thorne points out that alliteration like it is common in Welsh poetry called sing-handed. It was in all probability influenced by the theorem or true alliteration applied in syllabic verse. The alliteration doesn't have to be vocalized, and alliteration for the eyes, as we might call it, can also be applied, perhaps indicating that formal laments like these will be presented in writing as well as performed. And you can see on the right side of your screen the examples of the alliteration for the eyes, in the sense that you can't hear it, but you can see it. Gaeilge also applies alliteration in the 260 lines he composed on the death of Lieutenant General Richard Butler. Gaeilge displays grand virtuosity in his two great formal laments in the Cuine metre. He also practiced syllabic metre, but as the editor of his works, Máirín Ní Cheallachán, observes, he was no master of it, and he often struggled to put his thoughts across effectively when applying it. This kind of alliteration is not confined to Gaeilge's great laments. We have later examples from Dábhaidh Ó Brother, with around half of the 216 lines and Déag an Éile and Écat Widish displaying it. To bring our discussion on metrical and composition elaboration in the Cuine to a conclusion, we can look in more detail on Liam Ó Murchú's formal lament for James Cotter, Carrick Tuathil, County Cork. We mentioned line units with identical assonance already, of which there are many in Liam's poem. 30 examples of 2-line units, 17 examples of 3-line units, 14 examples of 4-line units, 1 example of a 5-line unit, 3 examples of a 6-line unit, and 1 of an 8-line unit. Here's example of, and alliteration in 32% of the lines in the whole poem. It's 352 lines long, quite a long poem. It's one of the longest, actually. Here's an example of 2 4-line units together, and I'll read these. Mavron ke orfus de Gaeilge na rofus nocher na mehe, na hjolfus and noigir chun reme, na hofus mas crowley and neasta. And then he continues in the same assonance, but he adds an extra declaration of an E with this one. So is lower skis the holti van Neala, is oostlief na loosteen na feted, is morchis dan noil ga fele, is a jori mar longidig gedailiv. On lines 223 to 248 of the same poem, Liam Ó inserts 3 verses with the 3A plus B format with identical assonance in the A lines. He closes this with a reverse B plus 3A verse. These verses are essentially a type of uran that he inserts into the body of his long poem. Now let's take a closer look at the poems themselves. There are many examples of laments in the Cuine metre, both in print and in our manuscripts. They vary in length, with most of them shorter than 180 lines or 45 stanzas, the vast majority being shorter than 152 lines. But a different method in terms of craft, form and narrative is required for the great laments composed on people who had an elevated position in Gaelic society. If you look over the works of well-known Munster poets from 1600 to 1750, we might be surprised to find that we have relatively little surviving examples of long laments in the Cuine metre. And you can see them on your slide there. I'll just go down them rapidly. The earliest we can date actually is Pádraig Gaeilge's, but Piers Ferters is probably from around 1640 as well. Mochrachas Mahoy Lemloho. Pádraig Gaeilge then comes along 1640 and 1646. The longest of those poems being Tridig Suas Ochuine and Chuinte. Then we have Dábhaidh Ó Brother, and you might be surprised to find that Dábhaidh only has 2 that fall into this category of long laments. Dábhaidh Ó Brother, Dursan Eg Éamin, Garrett, 352 lines, plus additional 68 lines in Uran. Déag an Éile and État Widish, 216 lines. Dear Rebeccaun Vui, 1665, and then almost a generation later, 1694, And the first one, Och Machaid, is time the Chesme, is only 166 lines long, but I suspect on reading it and rereading it that we might be missing a couple of verses. And a Her Vrahig Eachtig Moron for 324 lines, which seems to be complete. Well, the version we have seems to be complete. Ilia McCarthan and Duna on Sir James Cotter in 1705, Achum Kiev, is Diachad Fene. Then Egon O'Rahile, who composed many, many laments, but only 3 fall into this category of long laments. The first in 1696, Céad and Shifre Nisha at Fola, that the editors, but I think it was Deneen speaking, considers his best of the laments. And then 1709, and his last one, 1724, Saidrin Ni Che Inkin Fola, 268 lines long. The 2 by Donald Nathila Macora are not in print. I have read the poem from 1704, it's Coster Quita Kesta. The second one I unfortunately didn't have time to read, 1722. Oh, Manure is through on the scale. I did actually get a copy from the library, but the PDF is difficult to read and I didn't have time to go through it. And finally, then we have Liam Ó Murchú's elegy from 1720 or perhaps 1722, and James Cotter, Mór an Scoil the Rhain the Chesme. Central to the life of the court in medieval Ireland were displays of hospitality and opulence, and it was through feasts and gatherings that a chieftain or house could provide them. A poem would be expected from a poet, especially for, say, the birth of a child or a wedding. An occasion marking the death of a member of a hosting family was of particular importance. The poet would provide a lament on the deceased, and that poem would act as a portrait of the subject in which his history, his virtues, and pedigree would be brought together in verse. The poet, or indeed the keener, is tasked with announcing to the court the sadness brought about by the death, and he draws on his own emotions to convey the story to the people. In the best of these poems, we get a sense of the dead person's character, but even more so, we get an insight to the personality and thoughts of the composer himself, especially in the longer poems. We can draw comparisons with the cultivation of the concerto on the continent, when Corelli, Vivaldi, or Bach were flourishing. Ferter, Hackea, then later Ó Brother, were producing some of their great works in the form of the formal lament in Queen Meter. We can gauge from the outstanding quality of these poems that this subgenre had reached its peak by the middle of the 17th century, when the life of the Gaelic court was still functioning relatively well. We know little of what came before Pierce Ferter and Paul de Hackead's masterpieces from 1640. However, logic gives us ground to suggest that there were other great works that influenced them, and that the grand laments were not solely confined to Slavic verse. We know that Ó Brother, who belonged to the latter half of the 17th century, composed masterful laments in Queen Meter, Uran Meter. However, his latest lament, composed in 1687, Madig Kine, the Chail Ogan, is in syllabic Devi meter. Egon O'Rahile's 3 formal laments, composed between 1696 and 1724, show that there was continuity and demand right to the end of the long 17th century. Indeed, one of our latest examples, the aforementioned Mór an Scoil the Rhain the Chesme, composed by Liam Ó Murchú around 1720, is a truly incredible composition that follows a direct and unbroken line to Ferter and Hackea. I'm not aware of any any examples of long formal laments in the Queen Meter after 1724 from the poets of Munster, but I should reiterate that I have not completed an exhaustive search of the sources. This should not come as a surprise to us, as the great patrons of the previous generations were no longer about, with nobody to take their place. I haven't given it would take too much time to name and tell you where the subjects of these elegies in the previous slide come from, but you get an idea there from just the surnames: Butler, 2 for Cotter, 4 for Fitzgerald, and 5 for McCarthy and O'Leary by Egon O'Rahile. The position that the subjects of these poems held in Irish society in the 17th and 18th century. To continue with our concerto analogy, if an instrument from an orchestra had to play the quine, it would probably be the cello, with its plaintive, somber sounds and its ability to twist and turn its way through a piece, rising high and dropping low. These long laments navigate many different themes that can be accounted for in movement, with each movement setting a tempo and a tone. Typical are accounts of the manor that the deceased chieftain belonged to. Joyous descriptions of the life as lived in them in happier times are provided, with examples of the hospitality and opulence we spoke of already. The Munster goddess Léann takes over in the role of reciter from Egon O'Rahile and describes the boisterous feasts in the house of Callahan in 1724. Take note of the rhythmic sounds and the use of short vowel assonance. Have I got that written up? I don't. I'll read it out. Cultid an narragar maiden somnona, coro cleticha baranoga, fianar brishida ivigus mortis, Joel barad is bahish border, dronga tashel gan varig dan nostre, dronga titums a gushman of broche, dronga meshke gan helig dan horsen, dronga borab of lovert go glora. O'Rahile, still in the guise of Léann, continues. He describes the fragrant odour from the tender breath of the trumpeting band, airs played on harps, the sound of hunting dogs and horses and game being pursued along the ancestral lands of Callahan. He then lowers the mood at one stanza that reminds us that Callahan and his people are in fact no longer on these lands, and that they've been given over to jackdaws and the chatter of foreigners. An chluin fágáil na gog an tóra glór na naul go town Norvog. That sets us up for the next movement, in which Léann accounts for 24 generations of Callahan. This pedigree is identical to that given in An Leabhar Muinneach, or the Book of Munster. Having done so, she continues to depict the sadness of the Callahan territories, only to be interrupted by none other than Jupiter himself, who graciously implores her to continue tracing the Callahan line. Léann duly obliges and traces his descendants all the way back to Adam in a somewhat protracted 20-verse movement that brings our elegy to an abrupt and perhaps unsatisfactory ending. O'Rahile, it seems, had an uneasy relationship with this important facet of the elegy, which is captured in this poem for Owen Macora, when he states, with some frustration, after accounting for 5 men with the first name Taig, that Gach Taig the Taishach will Gaeilge, any Taig worth mentioning was related to you. Liam Ó Murchú uses the opening word Gaeilge to describe the mirth in James Cotter's great manor in Carrigtwohill. I've already discussed in a paper I delivered at Tonol 2019 in the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies how Liam Ó used at least 2 of Davy O'Brother's elegies and Ilya McCurthan's elegy on James Cotter's father as templates for his own production. Less obvious references to the work of Egon O'Rahile appear, suggesting that Liam had read or heard them, as well as clearer references to the works of Diarmid Macian Bhui, Macora, who was likely one of his tutors. Unknown God an God beléirdum, fá bhúribh na cuairtis in téimis, God an nafran da ganamh an séifse, is God vragarach da vragarach an féide, God vihil mar a gimmert mark a séhrach, is locht a líon na gleachich le chéile, God na nuasalos bua churmad caibna, is milchol daiúr alúr éigen. T.F. O'Rahile points out the similar uses of God can be found in Achram an Ád by Seamus Dowell McCourta from 1691, that Caton uses it, that there are examples in Aghalam na Seanórach, and that one instance dates as far back as the 11th century text Umrav Churig Hu Agurach. Liam was therefore drawing on a long tradition that was almost certainly passed on to him by O'Brother in this passage, but like Egon O'Rahile, turns the mood from mirth to gloom swiftly by dramatically juxtaposing the laughter of the court with the shrill cries of the company announcing the arrival of the banshees, setting his poem up for another movement. Is gurt an bháirse atá dá nation, gol na líg na líon na nesta, cui gach Philip a siusca he séhir, is God na maib machraid and nesta. The introduction of ancestral goddesses, especially Eel, Léann and Áine, as well as the banshees and the keening women, are quite common in these poems and act as a forewarning or affirmation of a death in a family of noble stock. Eoghan Rahila paid particular attention to these trilling movements, but Piers Forter's memorable words of comfort to the greedy Dingle merchants, Canahan, Chnosta, who feared that the howls that echoed over the lands of the Knights of Kerry were a forewarning of their own deaths, must agla wach ni bel dovson, mar ni chinid wana she and sortson. If fear came over them, they need not worry, banshees don't bewail their type. These ethereal members of the Queenic caste have been discussed by John O'Donovan, Padraig O'Donnell, Patricia Lysett, and most recently by Liam Ó Murchú in his examination of the Piers Forter poem in Gaeilge and Scoil 2019. I discuss the unusual role they play in the James Cotter elegy by Liam Rua in my forthcoming book on the James Cotter poems. I would now like to make some comments about the occasion and performance of these elegies based on allusions from the poems themselves. Piers Forter's elegy on the Knight of Kerry, Eamon Machan Ruther MacGaralt in 1640 is unique in that the poet was a chieftain himself who probably did not rely on the support of patrons. He is therefore writing a very personal elegy about one of his peers and a close friend who died in battle in Flanders. Piers remarks that though the death was a cause of untold grief for him, that it fell upon him to mourn his friend, as nobody else could produce a poem that would befit him. Dagala noch bebangene loson, madavna noch bemadavna holdit, for fear that they, the poets, would not have the capability to compose an elegy that would be a befitting elegy for you. Diarmaid MacCeán Mhuí takes a different slant on this some 50 years later, stating that not even the best poets who ever lived could justify in verse the feats of Sir Vrachach Macáta, using an identical line to Forter's. The vech inihil gan ivras darogan marine, bo marine cordlicht, suggesting in the opinion of this speaker that Diarmaid was familiar with the Forter elegy. Ilya MacCarthain and Duna echoes similar sentiments in his lament for Sir James Cotter in 1705. Composed only a few months after the death of Diarmaid MacCeán Mhuí, he states that Sir James deserved a eulogy from someone more accomplished in the arts than himself, and that if Diarmaid were still alive, it would be him who would step up and produce a lament befitting of Sir James. In his elegy for Eamon of Cherneen in 1640, Padraig Hakéad opens by calling Cuinan Chuinte, meaning a party of mourners, or perhaps a party of plaintive poets who were stood at Eamon's tomb. He tells them to come gather around, Didig Suas, as it was his duty, Dumas Dlacht, it was deserved, Dumas Cora, it was befitting, Dumas Dual, and because he was best informed on Eamon's thoughts and actions, Os Dum is Olcha a Roar Signivra. In the 8th stanza, he declares that it would have been a sin for him not to commit to the task at hand, as it was only he who truly appreciated the lost hero's mind. I think we have that on the screen. Deish búl Jedúil na grífe. The line Har chochtun féin gan é a chuine is a less obscure reference to the presence of other poets. The Gaeilge gur masan gur facha gur féadlacht. Har coch féin gan é a chuine. Deish búl Jedúil na grífe. I Jéhib the Yerslig had Diarmaid. In his other great lament, Hakéad delivers his apologies to the deceased Richard MacPierce, or Richard Butler, for delaying his elegy. He felt he should grant others occasion to mourn over him first. Lug dum féin and chafed and archachtas, the hidiv, a churig the chraig me, lik the huama a nuansha dagus, ik ced mile of chuine. In the following verse, he explains to Restored that it was the deluge of tears that fell from his eyes for 3 months since the death, le rahe, that caused the delay. We can therefore imagine an occasion 3 months after Richard's death in which Hakéad arrives at the court to present his poem. By way of an apology, he includes his audience in the performance. This allows him to swear that the impending panegyric was not influenced by his and Richard's affection for one another, but was an unbiased account of his true merits. Preceding Hacket's lament for Richard MacPearish, or Richard Butler, we have a Stown Con, which is a Rosk-like metre that may have been first performed at the actual wake 3 months earlier. It is likely that a poet was appointed to compose the foreign lament around the time of the death, and that shorter poems were composed and recited at the time of the wake, including the People's Keen. Other poets may have stepped up, poets who may have been aggrieved that they did not receive the commission. The chosen poet, if present, I believe would open proceedings with a shorter piece acting as a prelude for the major work that would be produced some months later. Supplementary pieces by Ó Brúadar, Diarma McKeon and Liam Ó Murchú, and perhaps Ó Rahile add weight to this. Ó Brúadar actually tells us that his verses in Uran metre attached to Thursan ag Éamin Vic Gerald are by Unfar Ciana Ihe Eilcha Slugga, composed by the same man the night of Éamin's burial on Slugga. It can also be noted that all these supplementary pieces are in Uran metre as opposed to Cuine metre. Liam Ó Murchú supplies us with a detailed account of the audience present at James Cotter's court for the recital. Every strata of Gaelic Irish society, high and low, are mentioned, including the poets. It seems that the poets, or those well versed in the arts of poetry, played the role of stern critic, or in some cases the role of detractor. This is particularly evident in a movement by Dávi Ó Brúadar in Thursan ag Éamin Vic Gerald, when Dávi, in a display of poetic prowess, traces Éamin's pedigree by accounting for all those left bewildered by his death, starting on verse 22 with those closest to him, his mother and his wife, both called Maude. He then moves through the immediate Fitzgerald territories and Hlain Ghlash, Shannon, until he branches further afield to Kildare, Ormond, and so forth. It is at verse 35 that Ó Brúadar embarks on the second expedition, accounting for an incredible 60 chiefs or sects in 7 verses. As this is being delivered, we can imagine the audience, an audience gripped, intrigued, and engrossed by his lore, knowledge, and skill. He then turns to the court and states that the uncaughtness of his language, as well as his poor and uninventive memory, is inhibiting him from grieving the aforementioned people, for giving the aforementioned people the praise that their dignity truly deserves. Ní tualan, tuatach mahangan, na ma chuine, chrian, dan chiapa, na ma ólas, dogras, begara, díspio gen nigni datish. This modest dismissal of his poetic output is effectively praising his work, as he knows full well that he's delivered a tour de force. Incidentally, this is one of the verses that Liam Rua reworked to the same effect in his elegy for James Cotter. But Dávi takes it a step further by way of explaining to his audience that were it not for the fear he had of strangers looking over him, and for the nitpicking of Christode and Caffra, rendering his intellectual resources dry, that he would give a specimen of letters patent. The names Christode and Caffra are used as a general reference to poets who may have been in the gallery playing the role of stern critic or arch detractor. It may be applied by Ó Brúadar to encourage interaction with his audience, his jesting with fictitious characters all adding to the dramatic element of the performance. Either way, it was a means for Dávi to quash any doubts that may be created by others as to who was best equipped to produce the elegy for Éamin Mac Garrett. It may be that the poets used to promote themselves in the hope of claiming the honour and reward that followed the production of a great lament on a chieftain of particular importance and means. In Ó Brúadar's other long cuine, Deag, Onéile, and Étach British, he dismisses would-be claimants by stating that both poets and minstrels will compose a lot of poetic dross in his wake in an attempt to claim for themselves whatever he left out of his own poem. This he says with some dejection. Scurhud fain, niedum a hille. I'll quit now, I'm not able for more. And by dismissing his own work again, Beat gur gaun a laurus rive. Though all that I have said is meagre, he gives the floor to the minstrels, O thod shud, Isul le shinim. since they are waiting to begin their singing, and allows them to carry on with the proceedings. Fágam, fuha, and chús and cluiche. Hackaird's exchanges and Dábí's defiance suggest that they composed their poems with the intention of reciting them themselves. We can imagine that their ears are close to the ground from the time of the wake itself, trying to grasp a sense of the mood in the community. It would be the poet's duty to hit the right notes, to have a sense for the occasion, and to relate the story as he saw fit. We will finish today with Diarmid Mac Ceann Mhuí Mac Chora's elegy for Lord Mountcashel, Sir Vrahach Mac Chora, or Justin McCarthy, who died in 1694 in the French Pyrenees from wounds suffered in battle sometime earlier. And incredibly, we have an image of Justin McCarthy or Sir Vrahach Mac Chora here. Sir Vrahach was the youngest son of Donachan Chúl Mac Chora, 1st Earl of Clancarthy, who died in Whitehall in 1665 while attending his eldest son's funeral. His eldest son Cormac was killed at the age of 31 at the naval battle of Lowestoft during the Second Anglo-Dutch War. He was on board the Royal Charles at Sole Bay when a cannonball struck his side as the Duke of York, later King James II, watched on. At this time, Diarmid was the appointed poet to the Clancarthy earldom, whose position was secured by the Restoration under King Charles II. Diarmid composed a lament on the death of his two patrons. They died within a month or two of each other, so he included both of them in the poem. Och, Mashaid, is time the chesme. This double blow was confounded by the death of Cormac's infant and only son the following year, which meant that the Clancarthy title went to Cormac's brother, Callahan. Sir Vrahach joined the French army at a young age and was a close friend to Louis XIV. He was back in Ireland by the 1680s. In 1689, King James gave him the title Lord Mountcashel, and he led Jacobite forces in Munster and Ulster. He was forced to surrender but broke his parole and left Ireland after the war to take command of Louis XIV's Irish Brigade on the continent, where he eventually met his death. Diarmid and indeed Ireland's situation had transformed since the double calamity of 1665. The confiscation of land was in full effect, with the 140,000-acre McCarthy estate up for sale. And he refers to it in his poem, Bewillid, the Valte is the Vahe of Ogert. The Earl of Clancarthy, Donachan Chúl's grandson, also called Donachan, was forced into exile on the continent with his uncle Sir Vrahach, one of the most illustrious of the wild geese, dead in France and buried against his wishes abroad. This left Diarmid bereft of his patrons and witnessing what was to become a mammoth and irreversible change to Irish life and society. News of Sir Vrahach's death is announced by the ancestral banshees to the McCarthys, as presented in this short and haunting poem whose author is unknown. The Huala Dolban again, is Marig Dum the Chwin an Vaid, a Queen Her Vrahag Malawn Caharadiv, Kebin a Taj. Golmana Chorkig Naguan, Goladuego Armui, Gol on Vale, Inchin the Mark, is Ban o Chantalif, a Queen. Over and will Fariras Trua, Tier na Kroga Cashel Hoy, the hit and Adam Wisha Vod, Ean Hu Kunta, Hiri Hafoi. Perla na Hayden is Posta na Moon, Phoenix Tlachta Ever the Burika Clue. On the end of the Naven the Cluhisha Foods, Sir Vrahach Echtach, Mac Dunacha, on Hul, and it was edited by Podger Brunen, Aikshe, 23. This is an early and rare specimen of the an early and rare Munster specimen of the Chi Round agus Uran format, 3 stanzas and a song, which was popular in the 18th century. Some scholars believe that it was composed by Egon O'Rahile on account of it being extant in only one manuscript written by Diarmid Ó Connachúr in 1715 and positioned amongst other O'Rahile pieces. I would suggest that it was composed by a member of the Blarney school that Diarmid Mac Ceann Mhuí was uachtaran of at this point. Note, Gul Duig O Armui, a cry from the north from Fermoy, which is of course north of Blarney, and Blarney, the seat of this branch of the McCarthys, and home to Diarmid himself. I would tentatively suggest that Diarmid was the composer of these verses and that he intentionally refrained from attaching his name to them, giving credence to the haunting death notice delivered by the banshees. The opening line in Diarmid's elegy, A her vrahig, echtlig, o vronta, echoes the final line of our short poem, Ser vrahach, echtach, mac dunacha and fool, suggesting that he was aware of it, or perhaps an acknowledgement that he did indeed compose it. And we have an image there of Blarney Castle as it stands today. What we find in Diarmid's elegy for Ser vrahach Macora is a work of exceptional beauty and elegance. He draws on his own feeling of loss, the sadness he still felt almost 30 years after Ser vrahach's father and brother died, while he is in utter disbelief that Ireland is being shared about zealously by foreigners like a joint of meat. Na danad da reint ma chraid mar spola le dúrhocht mar bahúhe bolshin. Everything as he once knew it is no longer, and not even the ancestral goddesses to the McCarthys can be heard grieving for Ser vrahach. They have been silenced. They no longer care, and they no longer maintain any hope of reprieve. The ancestry that they receive by Providence is bunos cún, upside down. And why? Because they have eloped with the foreigner. Is leachra gaul is ansa losan. He accuses the Keening women of falling silent. Is no maná selta féin ba bhólum, nor chos is scral dacht and Scoil sin. Diarmid attempts to rally the ancestral banshees, as opposed to the goddesses, to assist him in grieving for Ser vrahach by threatening them with a curse. Is na maná dúchais mo chuntracht beora, san gúsa muradugid chun of bosa. Any hope that Diarmid and his people had of driving out the English invaders has been quashed with the death of Ser vrahach. Och, ma chrach, ma va, ma vochas, as well as the deaths of Patrick Sarsfield and Colonel John Barrett, leaders of the Wild Geese and Paragons of Hope, who had died the year previous. He turns to the Greek goddesses, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, the deliverers of faith, and curses them for bringing death to his doorstep throughout his life. Is miniclum clachten were nanim the chodev, and asks with great dejection what sin had he committed, what revenge was being carried out against him that caused them to kill off those closest to him. Cread viniv the hillis, the voliv, the vosig, the corde, the vogum. He curses them to death, biach machlan fan mas mar stokach, and pledges to visit the men that he believes to be in deep mourning, rachatsa gandig, the fadav bevolum, the ve he skis, the qui gronach, and eventually bringing his poem to an end by stating that it was time for him to sleep, as he had cried plenty already. Is mihid dum kolla, the willis mohohin. This poem offers an insight to a time when Ireland was undergoing a forced transformation. We hear the final death knell of the many that told throughout the 17th century. We sense the dread, the fear, the sense of loss, and the complete lack of hope as experienced by Diarmid and his community in 1694. There is no sense of occasion to publicly mourn the chieftain in a great manner and the company of friends, relatives, poets, and minstrels, as in the times of Hakedan or Brother. The poem is a lament for Ser vrahach, for the great McCarthy clans, and for Gaelic Ireland herself. Cuine at her vrahach and the Cork, as I said, Aidan. Grumahagif.
You managed to cover an impressive amount of